raise it again at the end.
We'll see how late.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this public hearing of the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board. This is the last public hearing to consider comments concerning the proposed rent guidelines in Westchester County for leases commencing or being renewed between October 1st, 2019 and September 30th, 2020. At the conclusion of this public hearing, we'll have a brief recess, and then the tenants and the owners are going to make their presentations for our consideration and for the purpose of setting the rent guidelines for 1 year commencing on October 1st, 2019. I'm sad to tell you that our tenant representative, Jean Anderson, will not be able to attend this meeting.
Antonio Jones to the first floor. Antonio Jones to the first floor.
Or tomorrow's meeting, as she was hospitalized last week. But I'm happy to report that she's recuperating at home. I spoke to her today. She's in good spirits. And she thanks everybody for their support and best wishes. So Ms. Tamara Stewart will be the only tenant representative for the rest of this season. I will now like to take roll. Please respond if you are present. Public Representative Velene Acquah is not here. Public Representative Lamont Badru.
Here.
Public Representative Evelyn Bars. Owner Representative Eliot Cherson.
Here.
Owner Representative Kenneth Finger.
Here.
Public Representative Evelyn Santiago.
Here.
Tenant Representative Tamara Stewart.
Present.
And Public Representative Elsa Rubin present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. I would also like to recognize the counsel to this board, Chuck Lesnick and Peter Stecker, and our court reporter, Carrie Reed, and special thanks again to Barbara Hansen from the Building and Realty Institute, who takes the time and effort to record these meetings and to post it on YouTube. Our next public meeting will be tomorrow at the New Rochelle City Hall. This will be for the rebuttals of the owners and tenants members, and for the final vote of this board. Please note that this will be a public meeting. The public is invited to attend, but you cannot participate, just to be present. Now I would like to ask Chuck if he has any announcements for us.
So as many of you know, rent regulations were due to expire on Saturday, June 15th. On Friday, June 14th, the state legislature passed the bill, and the governor signed the bill on Friday. There have been some technical amendments introduced. Right now, HR is in the process of reviewing those bills and their potential impact, but rent regulations are in effect. We don't have the situation that we had a few years ago where they lapsed for a few days and then they started. Governor Cuomo issued a statement on Friday when he signed the bills that said, at the beginning of this legislative session, I called for the most sweeping, aggressive tenant protections in state history. I'm confident that the measure passed today is the strongest possible set of reforms that the legislature was able to pass and are a major step forward for the tenants across New York State. As the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Clinton, I know full well the importance of affordable housing, and with the existing rules set to expire tomorrow, I have immediately signed the bill into law, avoiding the chaos and uncertainty that a lapse in these protections would have caused for millions of New Yorkers. This year we have passed more impactful progressive legislation than at any time in modern history, but as we enter the last week of legislative session, we must not rest on our laurels. We must pass unfinished items on our agenda and continue the work that the people of this great state sent us here to do. He's making in this last paragraph a reference to just general bills that will be passed before the legislature breaks on Wednesday, the 19th of June. Expect a late night.
Any other announcements? That's it?
Well, as Elsa mentioned at one of the previous meetings, I'm actually retiring after this set of rent guidelines cycle, and it's really been a pleasure to serve as counsel to the Rent Guidelines Board for now 6 rent cycles. And, again, people ask me if I'm pro-tenant or pro-landlord. I wear the striped shirt and blow the whistle and make sure the game's played fairly and that the rules are enforced, both in terms of our open, deliberative, transparent process and as far as the rules are concerned. I know the board will be in great hands with Peter Stecker, who's worked for HCR for a number of years, and will be filling my shoes. And it's appropriate that this is in Yonkers, because I've done so many things here in Yonkers. I looked around at some of the buildings that have been built here, many of which have affordable housing in it because of the affordable housing component that the City Council enacted when I was council president here. So we are having a little bit of a celebration here right across the street at 63 Wells Avenue on the 24th floor after this meeting is over with beer and pizza and wine and cheese. So keep your comments short because the pizza's going to get cold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before I start calling the people who want to present tonight, I would like to go through a few rules and procedures for those testifying before this board. If you wish to address the board, please sign your name here if you haven't done so. Individuals, we have 3 minutes. And persons representing an organization, we have 5 minutes. We have a very busy schedule tonight, so we will really appreciate it if you stick to the time. Yes.
Get it back.
Peter is going to be the timekeeper. Please, when you hear the alarm go off, you may finish your sentence, but try to wrap up your presentation, your testimony.
There's another page.
There's another page.
This is blind, can I put my name in here?
No, you have to put it in here because we call it by order. It's okay. If you have materials to support your presentation, please give them to Peter and he will distribute them to the rest of the board. When you finish your presentation, please stay by the podium in case the board members have any questions or comments for you. Your comments should be addressed to the entire board and not to an individual board member or not to the attendees. I will attempt to alternate between the owners and the tenants.
We could all use one. Is there a pen here that we could all use? Can we use that one?
Yes. You can prepare. I will attempt to alternate between people who want to speak on behalf of the owners or people who want to speak on behalf of the tenants. Although it might not always be possible, I'll do my best. And please, I'll have to ask you to silence your phones now so that there will be no interruptions. With that said, I'm going to start calling the people here. We have a lot of people who want to speak tonight. I will call Albert Annunciata, representing the owners.
Madam Chair, I would respectfully decline to speak, and if I may offer whatever time I'm able to our chairman, Jerry Houlihan, for the industry presentation.
Okay. And Mr. Jerry Houlihan, you want to go now?
I'd like, if I could, Ms. Chairman, Chairperson, speak at the end so I could follow up all the other owners' testimonies and presentations and then make a proposal.
Okay. Lloyd Roberts, representing the tenants. Good evening.
Good afternoon to the board and to the members that's present. I'm just here to actually voice my opinion and ask for just a fear increase in terms of whatever may be given. I know I've been here numerous times before, and I've actually spoken pretty much, it comes down to the same basic conversation each time, and it's in regards to just asking for a fear increase. I know the landlords they're entitled to something. I'm not going to say they're not entitled to it, because if you own a business, you're willing to make some kind of a profit or make something, but not to get greedy. And in my situation, I've seen where greed sometimes gets involved in the way the business is run. In terms of maintenance, I waited for 2 years to get my apartment actually taken care of, the painting and everything, which is supposed to be done every 5 years. I waited for 2 years. Then the only reason why I was able to get it done was because I had to go to the DHCR. And the DHCR actually decreased the rent increases, which I have the paperwork in my hand. I came from work coming late, but I stopped to make sure I get this just in case there was any doubt. But the DHCR gave a decrease. And along that lines, I'm waiting for maintenance people to come in. I missed an appointment. Not that I missed it, but when they came to do something other than what they were supposed to do. The maintenance man left, never came back. What I got in the mail was an invoice charging me for missing the appointment when I was there and the maintenance man never came back. I have that also in my hand, showing the charges for me missing an appointment. So when I see that, to me it just brings the thought that it's only about the money, because if I'm there and the maintenance man comes and he disappears, he doesn't come back, and they're charging me for missing an appointment when I'm there and it's the maintenance man who doesn't come back, it showed me that no one is really looking at the tenant's side of it, because nobody got back to me in terms of trying to resolve the situation. And even to this day, I'm still dealing with this issue to get this $108 that they're charging me for missing an appointment. Still in the process and can't get resolved. I sent it into the office, they told me they didn't see the email. I re-forwarded the email, no response. And this is going on almost 3 years now, because this all started from 2017. This is 2019. So it's been going a pretty long time. I'm not saying that they're not supposed to get an increase, but I'm just saying with this kind of structure, the increase got to be fair, got to work towards helping the tenants. At the same time, whatever issues they have to resolve these type of things. And that's basically what I'm here for. I'm not going to really make a long, drawn-out thing of it, because I've only got 3 minutes, but I'm giving you guys a good idea as to what's going on.
Good timing.
Okay?
Please stay there in case somebody... Any questions from the board? No? Thank you. Ursula Di Resta, representing the owners.
Giving testimony on some tenant behaviors. I want to speak to you about some careless, irresponsible tenants that have caused significant...
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes at 8 o'clock. Please bring all the materials that you wish to check out to the first floor circulation desk. All the computers and printers will be turned off in 15 minutes.
We'll give you the extra time.
Okay. Back Careless, irresponsible tenants that have caused significant damage to a 22-family building that has resulted in costly repairs and unnecessary expenses for new equipment. I separated into 7 behaviors. One of them is pet owners, irresponsible pet owners. Our building allows tenants to keep cats. Tenants dispose of their kitty litter by dumping it into the toilet. This action results in litter swelling in the sewer lines, causing blockages that affect multiple tenants and multiple overflows. The main sewer line for the affected apartments then need to be unclogged by a plumbing service with a long drain snake. As per terms of the lease, if the tenant causes a blockage, they must assume the costs and they are invoiced for the service call. Tenants become irate when they see the bill and are reminded of the lease terms. They cause the problems, they don't want to take responsibility for any damage. I also have 2 tenants that run the water in their tub for their cat because it does not drink out of a cat bowl. When I saw that in one of the tenants' apartment, I couldn't believe how wasteful he was. If the tenant knew how much water he was wasting and how much it consumed, that increased my semi-annual water bill substantially. I've also had careless behavior due to tub overflows. A tenant, Miss C, caused a serious ceiling damage to the apartment below because she became distracted on her cell phone and allowed the tub to overflow. In addition to structural damage to floors and ceilings, she wasted both the hot and cold water. Miss C and another tenant on a different floor each caused water damages on multiple occasions to the apartment below and to the boiler room because, as we learned after sending in a licensed plumber to look for water leaks, that they both did not have waterproof shower curtains and that they were not inside the tub. This caused a lot of damage that we had to take care of. Smokers. See, people who smoke in the building. Disconnect your smoke alarms. This is a serious violation and for the safety of all the tenants in the building. Do they care? No. They do it again and again. I also have a tenant, Mr. A, who decided to stop paying his Con Edison bill in November of 2018. After Con Ed turned off his gas and electric service, he went with, without our knowledge, he approached and intimidated another tenant in the building to run extension cords out the window between their apartments. The non-paying tenant never reimbursed the tenant for his usage. He created both fire and trip hazards with extension cords all over his apartment. In April, Mr. B, who unwillingly provided the power, experienced an electrical power outage in his apartment. The electrician was sent to determine the problem. We found out there was a serious overload problem. We were told that the use of the extension cords to provide power to another tenant. We had to incur an electrical expense to install an outlet in our hallway light to have a light to repair Mr. A's bathroom ceiling that was damaged from Miss C above, as I mentioned before. Section 8, working tenants required to form, they are required to give the landlord a form before they move out, and the landlord signs off that they have paid their rent in full. I had done that. The form was given to me 60 days prior to the termination. In spite of the requirement to have the tenant pay her portion of the rent, the tenant decided not to pay her last 2 months, her portion of the rent. Section 8 told me that the tenant would not be able to move if her rent portion was not paid. In spite of Section 8's directive, the tenant did move some of her belongings. She never paid her portion and left a mess and a lot of furniture for me to remove. Prior to her moving out, I emailed Section 8 caseworker about the client's delinquent rent payment problem. She advised me to start an eviction proceedings. I must incur legal fees in order to show cause fees for the action of this tenant who's going to move anyway. The irresponsibility of the behavior of social programs is happening more frequently, with tenants displaying a sense of empower and entitlement, knowing that courts are reluctant to evict them in their programs and their advocates. Further, social programs seem to be tuned into this attitude and benefit financially, not by being held fiscally responsible for their clients' behavior. A few more seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just make it brief. Due to Amazon's 24, 48-hour delivery service, the cardboard, the commingles, all the recycles, tenants never break down the boxes. This has now caused a huge amount of garbage in our garbage shed area, and we have to now incur, pricing out refuge compacting services in order to decrease the amount of refuse.
Thank you. Any questions from the, please, I will ask you to abstain the applauses until the end because we are pressed for time tonight. Any questions from the board? No, thank you. Well, I notice here that we have a lot more owners, representatives who want to speak tonight, so I won't be able to alternate. I'm going to call everybody as in the order that they signed in. Franco Emilio, representing the owners.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Franco Elliot. My family owns and manages buildings in Yonkers, Mount Vernon, Ossining, and other areas in Westchester County. We have been providing decent, affordable housing since my father and my uncle started the business since the 1970s. Essentially, it's just very important that the board realize if not all the properties affected by tonight's vote represent housing built before, what I want to say is that the vote tonight represents housing built before 1974. This housing is essentially the housing that needs the most upkeep and maintenance. And what we have to do is we have buildings that are less energy efficient, more costly to operate, and we have to compete with newer buildings that don't have these problems. They don't even have to have any issues of coming up here and arguing for 2% or 3%, whatever, a small minutia increase compared to what we really need to maintain our buildings. Over the weekend, we pretty much lost a lot of our incentives to improve our properties. I really was shocked when this happened because I think New York State took a huge leap backwards. I have about 5 empty apartments that my family guts down to the studs, and we're not going to do that now. We can't, because we lost any rights or any incentives to make better housing for the public. So essentially now, not only are we not competing with newer housing, but we're forced to give tenants worse housing than before. Long story short, I'm requesting that at least a minimum of 6% to 12%, for 6% for 1 year, 12% for 2 years, because we really don't have anything else at this point to bank on, and even that, it's, at the end of the day, it's not really much. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Excuse me, sir? Sir, can you please come back in case any questions from the board? No?
I have a question.
Okay.
You said you have 6 to 12 vacancies, I think? How many vacancies?
No, right now we have right now 1 building, 4 empty apartments that we were going to gut rehab. We typically, this building was built in the 1950s, and we wanted to demolish the kitchens, the bathrooms, the moldings, upgrade the electrical, and the typical gut rehab costs between $40,000 and $60,000 depending on the size of the unit. And we would always, this was an incentive to essentially provide better housing to tenants and also incentivize the landlord, the investors, to improve their properties. But I was just saying, even though that's sort of nothing to do with this vote tonight, I just feel that this has to be factored because we lost a lot of opportunities to make better housing for the people.
So what are you going to do with those 4 apartments?
I call it the lipstick/Band-Aid approach. It's just paint it and try to get whatever you're legally entitled to based on the old bathroom, the old kitchens, which that also hurts because it makes my approach to finding good tenants harder. because most tenants nowadays want the stainless steel appliances. I'm competing with all this in front of us. And these rent regulations, they ultimately were intended for good purpose, but they really all cause more harm than good. I can tell you firsthand. I see it every day, you know.
Thank you.
Anyway, sorry.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, so your number for 6% for one-year leases and 12% for two-year leases, that's primarily based off of the state legislation that was passed to kind of counteract those costs?
No, well, yes. In the past, you sort of factor that when there is a vacancy, you have a lot of other bumps and incentives. I have none of that, so that's just the number that I was thinking would be fair, considering I don't even think that's fair, ultimately. I mean, I go above and beyond and think that this is really, we shouldn't even, none of this should be here. This should be free market, but I don't know. I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, that's, I don't, you know, that's just a number that I thought, or that from my conversations with others, other property owners, that we thought would be fair.
Thank you.
Have you had thoughts about building-wide improvements that are necessary?
Yes, actually, very good question. I wanted to do right here on North Broadway a new elevator. Not doing it. I have another new elevator I want to do in East Yonkers. Not going to do it. I have a roof also on Palisade. Doesn't pay to do it. I don't know. I'm really stuck right now. I don't know what to do. I'm really. The fact of the matter is, I can't. If you don't incentivize people to realize their investment, they're not going to do it. They're just going to leave it.
So is it a fair statement that not for these changes, you would have installed the new elevators and the new roof?
I already had it pending.
Contracts?
Oh yeah, I have the same way also with those empty apartments. I have to just take a step back and not do anything.
So you're canceling those contracts?
Essentially, yes. I'm going to be canceling them. And I also have MCIs pending right now with the division on other things that I've done. I don't know where I stand with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nee. Ken Nielsen. And you represent an organization, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
I want everybody to have it. Okay. Does this thing work? Hello?
No.
Okay, we got it. Okay. Okay, my name's Ken Nielsen. I'm a landlord in Yonkers, and I'm a member of the AOAC and the BRI. And I want to talk about 4 areas. One is the impact of the renewed rent laws. The second is increasing real estate taxes and fees, especially in Yonkers. The third is dramatically increasing water rates. And the fourth is the high maintenance cost of aging buildings. The first is the impact of renewed rent law. My colleague before talked about it, but basically, having spoken before the Rent Guidelines Board many times, some of the rationale for low guidelines says, well, you're going to get, you know, other income from MCIs and individual apartment improvements. Well, based on the renewed rent law, that ain't going to happen. Basically, that whole program has been decimated. So whatever increases we get is going to be the guidelines board for everything. And so I think you have to re-look at the way you're saying the guidelines reflecting the new law, which I agree is awful. I think in the long run it's going to hurt tenants, but we don't have to get into that right now. So the idea is that we provide affordable housing. Unlike a lot of the things in the city where a lot of people are kind of short-term investors, and maybe that's what they were trying to stop, most of the people here are buy and hold family businesses that keep our buildings for a long time, and we maintain them. but there has to be sufficient income and justification for making those kinds of improvements. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is increasing real estate taxes in Yonkers. The DHCR tables, which we just got a couple of days ago, show that the taxes increased
May I have your attention,
by 2.5%
please?
overall.
The library will be closing in 15 minutes at 8 o'clock. Please bring all the materials that you wish to check out to the first floor circulation desk now. All the computers and printers will be turned off now. The library will be open tomorrow from 9 a.m. until 8 p.m. Have a good evening.
That does not affect this meeting. This meeting will go on past 8.
However, in Yonkers, the 2019 county tax increased by 7.2%. 7.2%. Think about that in terms of the guideline we're existing now, 2% and 3% for a 2-year lease. 7.2% in 1 year for the county part of the tax. The county tax bill also includes specific other fees. The bill comes through Yonkers, but they add some other things. And so instead of raising taxes, which there's some state law limitations on, they add the North Yonkers sewer charge went up by 12.5%. The solid waste district charge went up by 4%. So the overall tax increased by 7.2%. For the city of Yonkers, the tax increase for the city taxes from 2018 period, from 2017 to 2018, we haven't gotten the bill for this year yet, increased by 9.5%. Now that is substantially higher than the quote 2% tax cap. I don't know how they're doing that, but you can see on the attachments to my thing. If you question my math, just do it yourself, and you can look at the sample tax bills I got, and this represents. It's not just one building; it's all the buildings. So this has to be considered in the deliberation, because although the average seems to be 2.5% overall, there's a disproportionate share of rent-regulated buildings in Yonkers. Out of the total of 25,000 regulated units in Westchester, 16,000 of them, or 2/3 of the total, are in Yonkers. And so that has to be, there should be an extra factor considered, because Yonkers has such a disproportionate share of rent-regulated buildings for the county. The third thing I want to talk about is dramatically increasing water rates. Utility costs, according to the DHCR tables, increased by 4.6%, again, in 1 year. A big part of that is water rates. Water rates in the city of Yonkers have gone up 315%. 315%. That's 3 times in 10 years. In 2008, the combined water and sewer rate was $1.5 per CCF, 100 cubic meters, feet of water. And it was 4.73 per 100 cubic feet in 2018. Do the math. So the water cost of the buildings, in some cases, exceeding the cost of fuel, which is hard to comprehend. We have no control over how tenants use the water. Ursula talked about her tenant running the water in the bathtub for the cat. Us walk into apartments and find that people have the hot water on in their sink to defrost chicken, and it's on for hours at a time, as opposed to putting it in a microwave or leaving it out.
Yeah,
we have no control over it. We just
I will
have
have to ask you to conclude your presentation.
What?
I will have to ask you to conclude your presentation.
Okay. Remember, I had to take time out to listen
Yes,
to the
we did give you that.
The last thing is the maintenance of aging apartment buildings. Some of my buildings are over 100 years old. During the past couple of years, my company has spent over $200,000 repairing brickwork in one property that didn't qualify for an MCI because of the rules of the MCI. That just falls into the expense category. substantial amount of work. This work will not, it was the right thing to do, and basically, responsible landlords need sufficient income to continue to maintain these aging buildings. So the total thing I want to leave with you is that combined, low guidelines, and especially the rent law, is the buildings that we manage in the long run, if the law and the way it's implemented are not changed, is you're going to end up with poor apartments for poor people, because the housing will deteriorate. Anybody who has enough money will get out and go to one of these newer buildings, and you'll end up with poor apartments for poor people. And I'm not sure, in terms of public policy, that's what you want.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Any questions from the board? No? Thank you. Please abstain from clapping. We need to move on. Matt Persanis. Is Matt Persanis here?
No.
Michelle, I can't read this last name. Representing the owners.
Yes.
Thank you.
It doesn't work.
Okay, so I have to speak loudly. Good evening, everyone. And
Good evening.
this is my first time speaking here, but I felt that I had to, my husband and I had to say something about speaking also.
Can we get the microphone to work with?
No, it doesn't work.
My husband and I are small property owners, the mom and pop landlords that the rent laws are going to affect the most. We want to continue providing plenty of heat for the winter, make repairs, and keep our property clean and in good condition. However, within the last several years, we've seen significant increases in operational costs, such as the Con Edison bill, which is, everyone knows, they separated, which is public policy, which they've done, delivery and supply. And right now, pretty much, they're pretty equal. There used to be a big differential. The water rates last year in Mount Vernon increased by 13%. Our insurance rates has gone up between 12 to 40%. Last year's inflation rate, as everyone knows, approximately about 2% in the New York area. However, when we add the school tax of 2%, and this is using New York State cap, the county tax 2%, city tax, it comes to a total of 6%. So you just add 6% yearly, and as you can see, we're not getting the increase from the board as we should to effect offset our operational costs. 2 weeks ago, I would have said an increase of 2 to 3% was modest, but considering the loss of vacancy leases and all the other dramatic changes in that law, modest changes from 3% to 6%, and that's maybe, because we haven't seen the overall effect of what these new rent laws will be. The small property owners like us really need sufficient funds to maintain and improve our buildings and make a profit, which I believe is not a dirty word. We have families too. We need the income to take care of our children and pay our bills. We want to continue providing people with decent housing, but unfortunately, it takes money to do so. It really does. And that's it, short and sweet. Any questions?
Thank you. Any questions from the board?
Thank you.
Howie Rabikoff.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Howie Rabikoff. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I appreciate the fact that you'll hear what's happening from my perspective. Here's my story. My family owns a 29-unit apartment building in the village of Westchester. We run a decent building. We care about our tenants, and I do what my father taught me to do as best I can. We service our tenants to death. The vast majority of our tenants understand who we are and how we choose to run our building. They understand how we differ from the slumlords of New York City. They understand we're not a faceless investor group looking for the highest possible return on our investment. Tonight, I'd first like you to take a look at a timeline. I aim to show you that by design, this system can never keep up. Let's take the current year as an example. Landlords are asked every year to provide information, income and expenses for the prior calendar year. In January 2019, we're asked to provide information for calendar year January through December 2018. That information will get used, so we've been told, when a decision comes down from this board on June 18th in the form of a rent guideline. This board's vote will take effect for renewals beginning October 2019, 3.5 months from now. And it'll dictate the increase for any renewal through September 2020. As you know, lease renewal must be offered for 1 year as well as 2 years. The renewal lease that begins September 2020 could go for 2 years, ending September 22. Costs from January 1, 2018 through December 31st, 2018 will affect rents from October 1, 2019 up to and including September 2022. There is no way a single year's information can accurately predict what will happen for a total of 4 years. This system is flawed. We can go through this process every year, and it gives us the impression each year that our decision has an effect on the coming year, when in fact it does not. The effect of your decision tonight will last 4 years. Keeping that in mind, I'd like you to know the problem I'm now facing. Given the lack of increases over the past several years, and if you'll indulge me briefly, going backwards in time from last year, 2 and 3%, 1 and 1.5%, 0 and 0.5%, 1.75%, and 2.5 and 2 and 7.75%, pardon me. Years 2014 through 2015, 1.5 and 2.5%, 3% and 4%, 1 and 1/4 and 2 and 1/4, 2.5, 4%, and finally in 2010 and 2011, 0% increase for both a 1 year and 2 year renewal. I have no savings for capital replacements. Half the pitched roof of my building needs to be replaced. 3rd year in a row. Everyone that comes to my building tells me we have to replace this portion of the roof. I can't. The guidelines this board has given over the past several years don't afford me the opportunity to have a cash reserve to do what the roofing experts are recommending I do. We have to do the best we can. We patch a roof that can't well be patched. Second, I'd like to give you an example of another fatal flaw. Apartment 3B in our building pays $709.15 a month for a 2-bedroom unit. The same apartment directly below pays $1,405. 3B pays a monthly rent that is 48% of the market rate apartment directly above her. $746 a month less. The costs associated with her apartment, the insurance, the fuel, the water and sewer charges, the labor for repairs and maintenance, cleaning supplies, electric for lights in the elevator, all those costs, market rate costs. Those costs are not discounted 52%. They're not commensurate with her below market rate rent. And ideally, I would ask you folks to address those costs. New York State wants the tenant to pay a below market rate rent? No problem. Subsidize my costs. Give me a concept that works. Give me a tax break, a credit. Give me some source to buy fuel at that discount, electricity, insurance. Give it to me all so that I can pass that same unit along to the tenant the way you want. State mandates ETPA. State should figure out a way of making up a difference. I understand. You can't do that. This board cannot force the state to make up the difference. It's not within your scope of power. The extent of your power is to determine a rent guideline. Therefore, the only choice I have is to ask you for a guideline to match the increase in my costs year over year and to make up some difference for all the past years where that was not done. I ask of you tonight for a 6% increase for a 1 year, 12% increase for a 2-year renewal. If it remains within your power to give a low rent increase, please give me the maximum allowable guideline.
Can't do that.
Can't do it.
Law doesn't allow that.
I'm sorry to learn that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank the governor.
Any questions from the board?
And
And just one clarification, you asked for 6% for 1 year. What was the amount requested for 2?
12%, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheryl Burton.
I'm new. I'd like to speak at the end, please.
She wants to speak at the end.
Alan Saretsky? Did I pronounce it right?
Did very well, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, and I don't envy your position up here on the board. It is an unenviable position you're in. Okay, you're asked to come up with something that neither party's going to like, but hopefully something that can be lived with. Amplifying some of what my colleagues said about the costs, the state government passes regulations that directly impact us, that make it difficult to even maintain the costs that we have. For example, New York State has passed, at least New York City and Westchester, that you can no longer use the lower cost fuel oils of 6 and 4 to be followed in 2020, leaving only number 2, which is costly to do, especially in a multifamily building, or go to gas. Gas is no longer available, if you could even spend the money to do it. Also, if you did spend the money to do it, to take, quote, the savings on gas from fuel at the time, as another colleague mentioned, the transportation costs have tripled in the last 3 years. That's the cost that Con Edison charges to transport the gas through their lines, having nothing to do with the product itself. The situation that you have is that we're here before you as the last bastion of hope to maintain the older buildings that supply the very people that you want with good housing. These landlords all are good landlords. There are bad landlords, no question. There are bad tenants, no question. We could fill a book with individual stories about it, but that's not what this is about. This is about maintaining a stock of housing that is older and requires the most money put back into it. If the money is not there, you can't do it. You can't get blood from a stone. All good intentions. Okay. It just doesn't work. And unfortunately, it falls to you because this will be your legacy as you're the last ones that have a chance to maintain. You're not going to improve it through this. You're not. You're going to maintain what we've got. And that's what is looking for you. Unfortunately, you know, it's like when I manage co-op boards, okay, I tell them, put a small increase every year in, get used to it. You're going to need it at some point. Put it in your reserve fund. The increases that we've gotten, as very well spoken by Mr. Acquah, didn't keep pace with inflation alone. And the government keeps adding more and more layers to it. So I ask all of you in good conscience, no matter what you come up with, people are going to be unhappy, but you want to maintain this housing stock. This is the stock. Someone moving into that building over there might be $3,000, $4,000, $2,500. You're talking about $1,200. You're talking about $900 in some cases. So I simply ask you to use your good conscience and maintain the stock that we have. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from the board?
Yes, can you?
Yes.
Can you explain the gas situation with Con Edison to make, why you can't convert to gas at the present time?
Yes. Con Edison has been fighting with New York State about the pipeline to bring the gas in. As a ploy, in my opinion, okay, Con Ed now has declared a moratorium on new gas conversions. Okay, they simply say, we're not doing them anymore. If you've already spent money and you're not in the pipeline already, you can't get it. So you don't have the opportunity to convert to gas even if you wanted to. So you're now stuck with number 2 oil, which by nature is more expensive, and because more people will now need number 2 oil, the price of that will only go up even more. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I wish you all good luck, and I hope you come to see
Thank
what
you.
you all live with.
Thank you. Jean DeResta.
It's a 2-part presentation. Dave's going to speak first. I indicated that on my document.
Okay.
I will follow next.
So, are you representing an organization or just by yourself? So you get 1.5 minutes each?
No, I'm going to go. My name is David Boudreaux.
Okay.
Yeah, different.
All right. Oh, so you will continue, he will continue whatever you start?
Correct.
Correct, okay.
Well,
Yes.
sort of.
Okay. Fair enough.
Good evening, Rent Guideline Board members, colleagues, and audience members. My name is David Boudreaux. I'm an asset manager at Houlihan Farms. I work with the chairman of ALAC, Jerry Houlihan. My presentation tonight, along with Professor DeResta, will rely entirely on information from reputable publications, rather than relying on social media or blogs which are notoriously opinionated, frequently erroneous, and have become a depot for fake and unsubstantiated material posted by unscrupulous actors. The 2 points we will present tonight are, number 1, the misstatements regarding the enormous profits made by landlords and the consequences to a building when the rent revenue falls short of its fiscal requirements. And number 2, conclusions based upon statistical analysis of recent HCR data and the further enhancement of the mathematical algorithm to compute fair rent increases. There is a recurring myth frequently voiced during rent guideline hearings that landlords make enormous profits and that therefore rent guideline board decisions are required to reduce landlord profits for the following year. This statement in today's jargon is fake news and clearly points out the lack of understanding of how a legitimate residential apartment business operates, and specifically how most small apartment rental businesses operate in the Westchester municipalities. There's also an untenable justification for arbitrarily compromising landlords' ability to run their business competitively with other businesses and earn a fair market return for their efforts and equity investment. First, let us dispel the myth that landlords make enormous profits. To do that, we accumulated reports from reliable publications presenting their findings on the comparative profitability of U.S. businesses. This literature research was performed over a 2-year period as part of efforts to develop an unbiased mathematical algorithm to compute fair rent increases for 1- and 2-year leases. What the findings to date have identified is that the real estate lessor business is typically in the middle of the rankings with other U.S. businesses. The definition of a lessor is the owner of an asset that is leased under an agreement to a lessee. The best metrics for comparing profitability among U.S. businesses are the return on equity, ROE, and compound annual growth rate, CAGR. ROE is an index that reflects profit over a fixed period, while CAGR is a useful measure of growth over multiple time periods. A recent study in Forbes places real estate lessors at the middle of its ranking with an annual ROE of 8 to 10%. A 2017 NYU evaluation of 7,330 businesses in the U.S. found a statistical average ROE of 10.4%. We know that the statistical average refers to the number expressing the central or typical value in a set of data, typically the most frequent. Thus, these 2 studies corroborate each other and demonstrate that real estate lessor profit is somewhere in the middle of the profitability spectrum of most U.S. businesses. A recent statistical analysis of the CAGR tabulation presented within the 2019 NYU Stern study of over 7,200 U.S. businesses reveals a range of negative 23.1% to 61.1%. The middle of this range is about 19%. Within this 2019 study, real estate operations and services had an average CAGR of 19.6%, which once again is in the middle of the range for U.S. business. So the published data clearly dispels the myth that landlords make an enormous profit. Rather, they typically earn a fair return on their investment. That is their expectation under our capitalistic form of economics. The 2 metrics, REO and CAGR, just introduced, are routinely associated with large corporate entities whose place of businesses are predominantly in large cities such such as New York City, San Francisco, and not in the much smaller Westchester County municipalities. Finally, we must point out the distinction between corporate versus non-corporate real estate businesses. This is germane to our findings that small landlords, who typically provide a larger percentage of the low-income housing in Westchester, report ROE most years that is less than the corporate average of 8 to 10%, and a CAGR that is less than 19.6%. This fact comes from discussions between BRI and YOA landlords who operate in Westchester. It is therefore disingenuous to claim that annual rent increases must be reduced or eliminated because landlords earn enormous profits. The goal of landlords in Westchester is to realize a fair return on their financial equity and labor without compromising their relationships with their tenants or allowing their buildings to fall into disrepair. Recall that the mandate of the original and new ETPA law regarding the Rent Guidelines Board is for their board members to determine a fair rent increase based upon economic factors and not relying on fake news or pandering to the tenants who will never agree to any rent increase regardless of the justifications. Another important issue that needs to be made references the New York Post article that reported in July 17, 2018 issue that 17,000 New York City Housing Authority or NYCHA tenants are over 3 months behind on paying their rents, which has resulted in the inability of NYCHA to make repairs to their building's infrastructure. Finishing up. Some tenants claim inability while others are simply refusing to pay their rent. This is a catch-22 scenario because rental income cannot keep up with the cost of needed repairs in these old structures, so the infrastructure continues to decline and more tenants will not pay their rent. This then creates a habitability problem as buildings need repairs but insufficient funds exist to pay them. This is happening now in New York City, and Westchester landlords fear that unless fair profits are realized or allowed for their risks and efforts, a similar scenario will occur to their buildings, many of which are 75 to 100 years old. Sound business practice dictates that a customer must share the responsibility for paying the additional expenses associated with any price increase. You have already heard how building operating expenses have risen in the previous year. A fair rental increase granted by the Rent Guidelines Board will protect both tenant and landlord, which segues to part 2. How can fair rent increases be determined?
Thank you. So you want to save the questions for after your presentation?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're not done. The cannons are coming. Good evening, Rent Guideline Board members, colleagues, and audience members. I present part 2 of our testimony and focus on the mathematical analysis.
Can't hear you. And can you slow down, please?
And talk a little slower.
Okay, we now present part 2 of our testimony and focus on the mathematical analysis of recent HCR landlord data, which arrived ridiculously late, and the status of the algorithm that computes fair rent increases using the unbiased methods presented in my colleague's presentation. During my presentation to the Rent Guidelines Board on June 5, 2018, the concept of an analytically reasoned approach was first introduced that could compute fair rent increases for the following rental year. During this past rental year, published literature and legal statutes were evaluated to determine if there is any precedent and actual formulae for such an approach. During this time, the model development also continued and now includes provisions to estimate rent increases for both 1- and 2-year leases. The literature review was assisted by a BRI colleague, Mr. Silvio Solari, who located a reference related to the 1970 rent control law that predated the 1974 ETPA rent stabilization law, but included an analytical approach for the calculation of maximum rent levels. That law stipulated provisions that included an 8.5% return on equalized assessed value. The key point is the then New York State legislature recognized that a computed rent increase using an unbiased formula that incorporated the prevailing economic conditions was fair to both tenant and landlord and eliminated the arbitrary nature of identifying a fair rent increase that is pervasive in the current approach. Why an analytical approach, such as specified within the 1970 law, was not incorporated in the 1974 stabilization puzzled me. Anecdotal references suggest the approach in the 1970 law recommended was too cumbersome and subsequently not incorporated within the 1974 ETPA law. One explanation may include the fact that computationally it may have been challenging. I would also point out that the PC or Mac computers, as well as software such as MS Excel, were not available in 1974-74. The first PC was introduced in 81 and Excel in 85. Only simple handheld calculators were available. Thus, the absence of computer systems capable of financial modeling may have been a contributing factor for not including computational algorithms in rent increase determinations. These impediments no longer exist, and all businesses are heavily reliant on computers and software for managing their business and making critical financial decisions. It's important to note that the newly revised law, the June 11th, also makes no mention of how fair rent increases should be determined, though they specify the use of financial data obtained from landlords and prevailing market conditions. Thus, it is imperative that we insist on the inclusion of computational algorithm to help guide RGB members in their determination of fair rent increases that are in accordance with the June 11, 2019 law, page 5, lines 25 to 34 stipulation on how increases are to be determined. This approach will ensure the real estate lessor business can operate to provide suitable housing accommodation for tenants and ensure that the problems experienced by night shift does not happen to privately owned Westchester housing stock. I'll now briefly state my conclusions based upon statistical analysis of the recent data and then present the status of an approach for one-year rent increases that, though not yet published, is a reasonable starting point for comprehensive inclusion model for computing annual increases. So conclusions from the most recently obtained data that also adds data from 2010. Based on recent observations and statistical analysis, the previous data at my disposal, the following conclusions are made. 1. Percent change in gross revenue per year for years 2010 to 2018 show a rate decline of 0.8% per year. The simple percent change average plus or minus standard deviation for this period is 6.7 plus or minus 9%. Percent change in cash flow per year for the years 2010 to 2018 is increasing at the rate of 0.14% per year, with a percent change average plus or minus standard deviation of 2.74 plus or minus 0.89. Well below the CAGR rate of 19.6 that was stated by my colleague in part 1. The cash flow trend for 2016 to 2018 is on the decline at the rate of minus 9% per year. These statistical findings using Westchester HCR data further refutes the myth that landlords make enormous profits, when in fact profit trends are on the decline and averages are all below the published average for U.S. businesses. You have the document. I explained how to compute using a simple algorithm that I designed for the rent increase for 1 year. With all the data which is not available, I could also compute a 1-year and 2-year rent increase and provide fair profit for landlords and generate suitable capital to ensure quality stock for the tenants in need. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Can you tell me, I mean, this is a little beyond me as a simple attorney. Can you tell me what percentage, using your formula, you would project would be a minimum for a 1-year increase? And let's do 1 year first.
I have my analysis sheets here. In the event that I was asked such a question, using the metrics that my colleague presented to you, there are 2 answers that come out, unbiased, statistically relevant. Using CPI and CAGR, a 1-year rent increase computes to be 3.78%, and using the NYC, POIC, and CAGR, the rent increase computes to be 4.8% for 1 year.
Can you repeat the first one?
3.78 for 1 year using CPI and CAGR, and using the New York City POIC, it computes to be 4.8%. Would you like this, Madam Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Cherson has a question for you.
I will give this to you after the questions.
Those figures that you just gave us,
Yes, sir.
do those include Is there anything in there reflecting a change in the law?
No, sir.
Let me finish. Of last week, which eliminates vacancy increases, basically eliminates MCIs, basically eliminates individual apartment owner increases. Anything I left out? Basically, all those things. Does that include it?
No, sir.
Okay.
This is strictly...
Are you just numbers, basically?
Strictly numbers, statistical analysis, using data that was provided to me by the HCR.
So that, to follow up, so that data that you got would have included for that period of time the fact that landlords had vacancy increases,
correct,
MCIs, IAIs.
Correct.
So following up on that, would you then say that this would be the minimum, but that there should be some factor added for the fact that landlords have lost MCIs, IAIs, and vacancies?
Yes. The point here is that this is based entirely on data that's available to anyone. And my objective in this was academic. I was challenged by the question, can it be done? Can an analytically reasoned approach be derived? And the answer is yes, because this board is unnecessary. I'm a mathematician. I specialize in artificial intelligence, mathematical models. People, you are unnecessary. That's just the way it is.
I beg to differ.
Yes.
I have one more question. Are you familiar with the fact that HCR, well, it was formerly DHCR, establishes the increase for rent-controlled apartments using algorithms?
Yes, that was cited by my colleague.
And do you know what those increases have been over past years?
The average number that we were able to find was something in the neighborhood of 8 to 9%.
For rent-controlled apartments.
Rent control.
Exactly.
Yes, rent control.
Rent-controlled apartments, which is under the prior law.
Correct.
Prior to
Predates the 1970s.
So that was 8 to 9% per year.
Yes.
Thank you.
And what agency or entity promulgated the 8 to 9% increase?
That was the New York State
New York State
law.
DHCR.
Yes.
DHCR determined that that should be the increase for rent-controlled apartments.
Yes, according to an algorithm
that they use.
A verbal algorithm, right, that they but has never been used.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Are
There's
you
a
ma-
lady,
Oh, I'm sorry.
only because
Yes.
she's been very diligent.
Miss Santiago.
Like one of my students,
I can see her from
recognize
here.
you. I see you, please.
Thank you, I'm a teacher
sorry.
as well, thank you. So you mentioned 3.74% to 4.8%
Yes.
based on the algorithm?
Yes.
And that was for 1 and 2?
No,
just
1
for
year.
What would that, based on the same algorithm, what would the 2-year be?
That's much more difficult to do. The equations are more involved because I need to know more. I need more data. I need to know what is the ratio of income for 1 year, 2-year leases. I do have equations for that, but I don't have the data, so I can't turn the crank and operate my algorithm.
And those increases were based on the old law, not the new law that was just passed.
Thank you.
No.
Yeah, that was going to be my question too, for the 2 years.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
next year, if I had more data, if I had more time, I could provide a more comprehensive number. But given a few hours, it was Father's Day when I received the information at the chagrin of my wife and my daughters and my grandchildren. I felt I had an obligation to my wife's business so that I could make a presentation, a coaching presentation, and challenge the nonsense, and that's what it is, nonsense, hubris, that landlords make an enormous profit. Rubbish. Total rubbish.
Mr. Jeremiah, Holly, honey? I
Ms.
can't.
Chairperson, again, I'd like to defer to the rest of the owner presentations, and I'd like to make the last presentation. Thank you.
So this is
He's our president of the AOAC.
Roger
Season wine.
Season wine.
Yeah. I'd like to point out, statistics can be very tricky.
And you are representing the owners, correct?
Yes. Roger Season Wine, we own buildings in Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Mamaroneck, Larchmont, and Greenwich, Connecticut. We are, as most of the owners are here, buy and hold landlords. For the most part, we own buildings that were built somewhere near 100 years ago. I'm a buy and hold landlord, despite the fact that I'm almost 80 and that I've got Parkinson's and a couple of other disabilities. Luckily, I have a son who's helping me continue the business. I'd like to say that we, the landlords, are not an enemy. We, the landlords, are attempting to provide a decent product for our customers, just the way any business does. We have to satisfy our customer. If the customer has a problem, we have a problem. Now, frankly, because of the contentious times we live in, we have enacted a law, a state law, which is not reasonable, it's not fair. It has to be modified over time with discussion between the public, landlords, and others involved. Now, I can only say to you that we have tried to be responsible landlords, as have my colleagues who have spoken. And the first thing I'd like to point out is that the statistics that are presented in the figures that DHCR has submitted are not accurate. You may recall, some of you that are almost my age, you may recall that I started out as a pollster. I worked in survey research for Exxon, Mobil Oil, Conoco, Westinghouse, and numerous others. And so I can tell you that the survey of landlords is based on a 31% response rate, which is idiotic, okay? There's no reliability to those numbers, apart from what Mr. Rakoff talked about. About 10 or 15 years ago, we bought a building, 10 or 15 years ago, a building that we bought, by the way, with credit cards, 214-16 South 3rd Avenue, Mount Vernon. We were able to get rent stabilization eliminated for that building because it had been vacant for 10 years and more than 75% renovated. I assume that's gone now. Nevertheless, for 10 years, we kept rents in accordance with the guidelines, because that's what we felt was fair and reasonable. We sold the building because we couldn't manage it at that time to an adjacent landlord. That landlord then took, who was not a buy and hold landlord, by the way, that landlord then took to virtually doubling some of the rents in the building. In fact, we were able to find housing at 435 Webster Avenue, which is an elegant old Tudor building that we own, in which he was paying less rent than the new landlord at 214 was charging, and about twice the space. So that was our customer. Our customer had a problem. We tried to help him, as I'm sure many of the other landlords have done. We need another situation. We had a tenant who was victimized by fraud. The fraud was by two previous tenants who lied as to the tenancy and as to whether the tenant in question had moved out of the building. We proved that the tenant in question moved out of the building and was taking two apartments as their primary residence. Nevertheless, we did not evict the nephew of the defrauding party. We worked out a compromise where rent went up, but only to $900 a month, when the market for this apartment in that building is about $1,400 a month. So I ask you to consider very carefully, please, and not with algorithms. I ask you to consider what is fair here. What is fair in light of all the developments that have gone on? We are not the enemy. We have tried our best to keep housing safe and affordable, and I think for the most part we've done that. We buy and hold landlords need your encouragement, and we're being impacted by a state situation that has frankly been generated in part because of the national problems that we have in this country today, which separate us as we're all working towards the same goal, perhaps from different perspectives, but we need to work together. Please help us.
Thank you. Sir? Please stay there. Please stay at the podium.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I don't know how long I can stand up.
Any questions? Yes, Ms. Stewart.
Yeah, have a seat. Thank you. Then I won't be able to get up.
Ms. Stewart has a question for you, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your testimony. Do you respond to the surveys for all of your buildings?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Do you encourage other landlords to do the same?
Yes, we do.
Okay, because since the surveys are voluntary, HCR cannot compel people to respond. And certainly more data would be helpful, but if only, roughly half of the owners respond, there's really not much that...
Not even half. It's 30, somewhere between 30 and 35%. It's still... That's assuming this is a probability sample to begin with. If you
say that again? You said that's
in other words, there, I think something like 14,000 survey respondents.
14,000 units.
I beg your pardon?
14,000 apartments.
Yeah.
Units.
Buildings.
No, units.
Units.
Apartments.
Apartments.
14,000 apartments.
Well, in any case, even assuming that that's a representative sample, which I don't assume, despite the algorithms, even assuming that that probability sample is valid, you're only getting a 30 to 35% response rate. And who knows what biases are there. It's important. Look, our insurance on all of our buildings, we own about 20 buildings. Our insurance on those buildings in the last 5 years are up 65% on insurance alone. Not to mention, I must compliment Mount Vernon on the fact that they have tried to keep tax increases fairly moderate as compared to some other communities. But nevertheless, there have been increases there.
Yes, Mr. Cherson.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for council. Are responses to the surveys voluntary or are they required by statute?
So they're voluntary because a number of years ago there was a case on Long Island that said the original rule...
That has to do with penalties. I'm talking about, aren't they required to file these?
Well, they're required, but there's no penalty. The penalty was that if you didn't file, you couldn't get the increase.
Yes,
but the judge said that was too harsh. So now it's just a requirement with no teeth.
Right, I understand there may not be teeth, but Ms. Stewart said they're voluntary. Could you describe them as voluntary? I mean, they are required to file them, correct?
But they don't.
Wait, I'm not in, sir, please.
Right, we're required to go 55 miles an hour, but some people go 56.
Well, but the point is, you break the law, you break the law.
Exactly.
So the law is that you got to file it.
They are required,
Come on, Chuck.
but there's no penalty if you don't.
He didn't ask that.
But the question is, are they voluntary? They're not.
No, they're required.
Thank you.
The problem is that we don't have accurate data, and we need accurate
We
data.
believe that.
We need some help.
Anybody else from the board has a question?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let the record show that Public Representative Eddie Mae Barnes is present.
And has been since 7:30.
Yes, I just saw her. Bob Hattal?
It's me. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
My name is Bob Hattal. I got into the real estate market. Welcome, thank you for having me here. I got into the real estate market approximately 30 years ago, and this real estate was not my business. I'm actually an executive chef by trade. When I worked as a chef 30 years ago, I filed my taxes. My accountant says, you better either get married or buy real estate. So I bought real estate. Lo and behold, when I bought real estate, I bought a little taxpayer. The taxpayer, I didn't realize anything or knew anything about rent control. Over the course of 30 years, I learned a lot about rent control. I learned there's also scam artists out there. I also understand that DHCR is an agency that's run under the government. That's a state-funded agency. And there's a lot of gray shaded stuff I want to bring up here, but I'm not sure if this is the opportune time to bring it up because I don't want to mention Mr. Rodriguez's name.
He's not here.
Well, I know the walls have ears, and the ears will reverberate up to White Plains. I understand that piece. But anyway, so the taxpayer building that I bought roughly 30 years ago, I managed to double the rent in 30 years, and to footnote the professor's matrix scale, my rents doubled in 30 years, but my expenses tripled. Explain to me, how does DHCR view, what can they dictate, how much money I'm allowed to make? I just did another research on rent controls, and I'm reading here about what Mr. George Latimer has written here. It says, what is exactly rent control? Rent control limits the rent an owner may charge for an apartment and restricts the right of any owners to evict tenants. Some municipalities adopted rent controls for apartments built before 1947. Does anybody understand how relevant that year is to 1947? Anybody understand why it was built in that? That's a question for you guys. Anybody want to answer?
World War II.
I'm sorry?
World War II.
Okay, so how many of those people that are living in these rent controls?
Yeah, right after World War II.
2 years after the war.
Yeah.
So how many of those people that are living in those apartments today are still in those apartments after World War II? If you do the numbers, you'll realize 99% of those people are either dead or in nursing homes. Number one.
But there's succession rates, so sometimes...
I totally get that, but how many more successions does it take? 2, 3, 4 generations?
That's why most of rent control is now in stabilization or ETPA. The number of rent control units have diminished each year.
Yeah, and then you have another rent control that applies to 6 families or above. This is a 3-family taxpayer. The taxpayer, a little taxpayer.
So that's not covered.
Well, according to Mr. Rodriguez, it is. But we'll talk about that later in private session.
Your building is 3 families.
The building is...
I don't want to get sidetracked.
Your building is 3 families.
I'm trying to advocate for my tenant as well as
I have a question. Is your building only 3 families?
Yes, it is.
You're not subject to rent stabilization?
We'll talk about that later, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Finger, you and I had this conversation about 2 months ago along with Mr. Houlihan up in White Plains when we had the dinner at the Grand Plaza. And you guys both had the same reaction. You were having the same reaction. Let's have a conversation with Mr. Lesnick and we'll figure out where this is going. But anyway, so the Yonkers Parking Authority decided, how am I tying all this in together? I'm advocating for my tenant. Yonkers Parking Authority decided they want to put meters alongside Yonkers Avenue. I got a petition and I want to say maybe 100 signatures to sign a petition against the parking meters because that one tenant claims he's a disabled resident or tenant. So, of course, Yonkers Parking Authority waived putting meters in so that the tenant can step out of the store and walk into his car and get into his vehicle. I'm not telling you that he had a second vehicle somewhere else. How does he get to it? God only knows. We won't get into that. So anyway, in that building, I'm just going to I'm going to jump all over the place. You guys try to make heads or tails out of this. And you can figure out how many scam artists are moving into these new buildings and getting away with this murder. And how many tenants are still living in these rent control apartments getting less than half of what they're charging for low-income housing here. Are any of those landlords on the way here tonight? The ones that are putting up all these buildings around us?
No reason.
They're not controlled. They're new, they're built past 1974, so they wouldn't be subject.
No, but there's low-income housing in there.
There's
got to be 20%.
We have nothing to do with that. That's not within our purview. Believe me. We have enough problems.
But I'm saying they're getting a lot of tax breaks in White Point. They're getting a lot of tax breaks. Studio apartments are getting 21%.
It's irrelevant to what we do.
So my one tenant who lives alone has a 3-bedroom apartment, paid $800 a month. Paid $800 a month, and here I have to sit here and advocate for him because he can't walk to his car when he works a full-time job. My point is the DHCR should not have any oversight over this little taxpayer. Very simple. I don't understand what went wrong here. Secession? I don't know. He was there back in 1968.
Sir?
1968, he was 10 years old.
Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Your time is up.
All right, anybody have any questions?
Any questions for?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have the card.
I can't make out this last name here. Nick, I can't make the... How do you...
Not related, by the way. That's the same way, but I don't know who it is, so. Good evening.
How do you spell your...
Members of the board, thank you very much for your service. Thank you for the
Sir, what's
opportunity.
your last name?
Marcola, M-A-R-K-O-L-A.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm an immigrant. I grew up in the communist country, moved here at the age of 22, and I did not speak English. So if you can't understand me, my apologies. Own a property here in Yonkers, not too far from here. Bought it about 20 years ago. It's 12 units. When we bought it, a number of them, great tenants were in there. Of the 12 people that we worked with back about 20 years ago when we bought it, they're still in the building. I know we hear a lot about bad landlords and greedy landlords and so forth, but there's also some great landlords out there. Every tenant that we have in the building has our cell phone numbers. They call us at midnight, they call us at 6 o'clock in the morning. Whatever they need, we're there for our tenants. Some of the tenants that had one bedrooms when we bought the building, they paid rent about $500. Today those rents are about 800 something. Yet some tenants that had a rent about 700 back then, those rents are under 1,000 today. And we have a tenant where 3 of the members of the family live in a 2-bedroom apartment. Back when we bought the building, rent was under $400. Today it's under $700. A couple months ago, I was fortunate to open up the Con Ed bill. And you probably know this better than I do. Con Ed had a notice in their bill that they asked for 9.5% increase in what they're charging out there. Fellow landlords did speak about taxes going up, insurance going up, water and sewer. None of our bills have gone down or stayed flat over the years. Everything has gone up. We're there for the tenants. We have tenants who were not born when we took over the buildings. They're there. The people are married and so forth. We have a great relationship with our tenants. I work in a different industry. We bought this as an investment. I have a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, but I would like for those 2 children to go to college one day, and this was an investment for us. Over the years, we worked on the roof, we worked on the brick, windows, doors, camera system, and everything, thinking that down the road we'll be able to recuperate some of those costs. I'm not going to repeat what you guys know quite well. Everything has been taken away from the landlords except for what you guys control. I understand that you want to do what's right for the tenants, but I also urge you to think about us, landlords. 8 out of 12 are still in the building after 20 years, and most of them pay under $1,000 of rent. Our expenses are going through the roof. I love my tenants, but guess what? I love my family even more. If I can't maintain this property, I'll end up selling it. And let me predict the future for a second. If that's the path that we go, then don't be surprised if there be management companies out there, for the customer service reps in India or the Philippines. So when a tenant has a problem, be calling someone out of the country to deal with a legal problem, not calling me at 3 o'clock in the morning to get out of bed and run down there and try to take care of the tenant. I understand you're in a very difficult position trying to balance the act of both sides, but just think, if people don't make money, if you don't have an incentive to be in this business, we'll sell, we will have professional landlords coming in, the quality will go down. Most of the tenants you're trying to protect probably get impacted a lot more, but as I said, 8 out of 12 are still in our property and not going anywhere. In the 2-bedroom apartment, 3 of them work, so they make a lot more money than I do. But we're very happy with the tenants, so anything in your power to think long-term, so you protect the tenants as much as possible, but also give landlords an opportunity to invest in their properties, reinvest, so we can keep the old tenants. Somebody else said this earlier, most of us are operators here. We're not buying, we're not flippers, we're not moving from one property to another. 20 years on one property gives you the idea. Going back to the 9.5% Con Ed rate, I think it's very fair to at least increase the one-year leases should be somewhere in the 6% range. Just think taxes, insurance, and everything else has gone up every year, and for two-year leases, probably double that.
Thank you. Mr. Cherson has a question for you.
You said if you can't make it, you're going to sell the building.
Yes.
Okay. To sell the building, do you need a buyer? Right. And does the buyer need a mortgage?
Sure.
Right. And if there is no buyers and no mortgage, that's a big problem, isn't it?
That is a big problem. You had in the last couple of days it was published that the banks, the local banks that lend, all their stock prices have gone down. I think there was a problem with about $2.5 billion of market cap of local banks has diminished in the last week or so.
Right. So the chances of finding a buyer who can get a mortgage is greatly reduced because of Albany.
Right.
Thank you. Anybody else has a question? No? Thank you. Ms. Cheryl Burton?
My name is Cheryl Burton. I live in Wisconsin part-time and I live in White Plains part-time. Last year I spent 3/4 of my time here making repairs in my apartment by myself. I now own an impact driver. I never even knew what one was. The property has been in my family since the 1800s. The property I own is on Hunt Place. Susan B. Hunt, my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. I am taking care of that property. I'm the last one. In, 1924, the buildings were built. They're old, they're townhouses, they're vintage, they have a lot of character, but they're very, very old. I was at Tommy's Deli the other day, getting my sandwich in North White Plains, which I love, and I'm sitting there getting my turkey club, and I'm going through the post, and I'm like, oh my God, what were you doing? Are you not paying attention? Okay, never do, okay. And so then I called up my real estate person and I said, have you not been paying attention? What's going on? You know, you're supposed to pay attention to these things. And he sends me yesterday the New York State Legislature dated June 11. Sorry?
Yes, Ms. Cheryl, you're talking to the board.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I've never been here before, so I don't know all these people. So I'm just, okay. Yeah, I probably don't.
Can you pass the article to me and I'll pass it?
Yes.
No, that one I have, the newspaper.
The newspaper?
Yeah, the Xerox one we all have, but this one we don't.
Okay. And then I called the DHR, who was so kind and said, oh, do you know about the meetings? Because I always call for help. And I always want to know if I'm doing the right thing, if I have to pull a permit, etc. Anyway, long story short, I found out about the meeting tonight and I came. I'm just absolutely terrified right now because I have ETPA apartments and I don't know what I'm going to do. All of a sudden, the value of my property has plummeted. That's all I have to say.
Excuse me, just stay there, please,
Okay.
in case we have. And thank you for coming. Thank you for your presentation. It's very important for us to hear
Thank you. Thank
everybody.
you for recognizing me.
And anybody has a question for Ms. Burton? No? Thank you.
Am I good?
Yes, you're
I
good.
like this, that. Thank you.
I would like to call the Reverend Lofton Woods, representing the tenants.
Where's Emma?
First.
There she is.
And I have to mention that the Reverend is also a former member of this board. She used to represent the tenants. Welcome.
Thank you. Excuse me, everyone. Good evening, board members.
Good evening.
Nice to see you. I'm going to be brief, but I'm not. I'm Reverend Emma Lofton Woods. As it was stated, I am a former board member, tenant representative, but it's just hard to stop advocating. So I am a representative for tenants and neighbors of New York City, Westchester County. I want to pass out something, which I left in my seat, so give me a minute. Let me go get it. I'm just flabbergasted with how much I don't know that. Y'all disrespecting the chair. She says stop clapping. Y'all keep clapping. Listen, it is not an easy task. I know. But I want you all to look at this article where it talks about how the tenants were harmed last year, how they were hurt behind the 2% and the 3% increase. Now you've heard the owners talk about their expenses. We have expenses as well. I speak not only for myself, but I speak for my neighbors and other tenants in the city of Yonkers. Our health care, our car insurance, gas, which is now about $3 plus a gallon. We have tenants, lots of seniors who are paying $1,000 or more for their unit, but it is not 1/3 of their income. The maximum income in Yonkers for SRE and TRE is $50,000. So they're making a choice as to, do we pay our rent, do we buy food, or do we buy medicine? And I've heard that same thing for the last 16 years. It hasn't changed. On any given day in rent court, last time I was here supporting tenants, there were 111 eviction cases on the Yonkers Landlord Tenant Court. Why is that? Not everybody decides to withhold their rent because they just feel like doing it. There are mitigating circumstances why people are in court. There are maintenance that are not being handled by owners. So tenants were telling me that when my lease came, I didn't sign my lease because I had maintenance, mold growing in my apartment. Okay, so now you're in eviction court. Law says now that they have to give you at least 1 year when you're in landlord tenant and you're facing eviction, at least 1 year to find a suitable apartment in your neighborhood that you can afford. Thank God for that. But those people that are in court right now or facing becoming homeless because that law may not be recognized in court. People talk about what tenants aren't doing. Landlords don't always hold up their end of the bargain either. Also, owning is a choice. There's a building at 11 Lawrence Street that just sold, a rent-stabilized building, for $2.2 million. It's quite an investment. It's an old building. New Realty Advisors Inc. Now, if people are going to continue to invest in these buildings because they want to provide affordable housing, then I want you all to understand the dynamics here. It's investment first, and my return second. Tenant is third. Tenants need a place to stay. You all know that as well as I do. Landlords need something to maintain their units. But 6% and 12% is beyond harm and hurt. 2 and 3 was supposed to be hurtful to the tenants. Imagine what 6 and 12 will do. It would behoove you all to give the tenants of Westchester Lower County the same guidelines that I received. 0 for a year, don't forget, for a year, and 1% for 2 years. We're still in the same county. They said that there were circumstances that warranted such an increase. Well, the people in the city of Yonkers, southwest Yonkers, from Getty Square down, face the same situations as Ossining. The same, if not even more devastating. You should take a ride down there and look at some of the buildings so that you can see for yourself. It would behoove you all to do less than the harm that was done to tenants last year.
Thank you, Reverend. Any questions for the Reverend?
I have a question too.
Yes.
Reverend, don't leave so fast.
Can't get off that easy.
You can't get off.
I got a plane to catch.
Isn't it so that in Ossining you personally had proposed a larger increase than 0
I
and 1?
propose the same increase for Ossining that I did for Westchester to keep it consistent.
Okay, my second question is, do you agree with this article you handed out?
No, I don't. I don't
Okay.
agree that I should have been singled out. The
All right.
entire board voted for a 2 and a 3%. I didn't know that I had so much power that I was just the board and I could decide what the increase
So
was
you
going to
think
be.
this is an inaccurate article?
Well, the article was a slander, but the 2 and a 3%, I think, was just.
And who wrote the article?
I think we should just stick on
All
the...
of that information is on the article.
Okay.
Let's not do it tonight. I can go toe-to-toe with you, you know it. Have you finished?
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend.
Don't do it.
Mr. Jerry Holohan, I think it's your turn now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. One more.
We'll never get it. I got 20 minutes. Let's do it tomorrow.
Good evening.
Make it executive.
Members of the Rent Guidelines Board, I am Jeremiah Houlihan, Chairman of the Westchester County Apartment Owners Advisory Council, also known as the AOAC. We're a trade organization representing owners of approximately 27,000 apartments in residential buildings subject to what's now called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. Tonight I present the owner's summary testimony for this year. As you know, the law states that you as a board must incorporate in your discussions the economic conditions of the real estate industry, the present and projected operating and maintenance costs of ETPA housing, and the cost of living indices. What's been ignored in the new legislation by making the law in perpetuity is the movement from regulation to free market when an emerging in the housing supply ceases. Your decision tomorrow night to set the rent increases for leases expiring at the end of this year and into the next, as well as establishing a low rent guideline, I'm going to strike that because we can't do that, can we? Okay, so you've heard from our owners, and these, by the way, are the small owners in Westchester County, family-run businesses that are here to hold their properties. Tonight and over the last 2 hearings of the ever-rising costs associated with maintaining these buildings that were built before 1974, typically between 1930 to 1960, making them on the average 75 years old. So the maintenance and labor costs are constantly increasing as these buildings age, along with the other expenses of the real estate taxes, insurance, fuel, and utilities. And according to the DHCR tabulations that you've seen and reviewed, our total expenses have increased 4.7 from last year. The New York City price index of operating costs for similar buildings, like ours here in Westchester County, have increased 5.5% from last year. And now, with the removal of all the property and apartment improvement programs, as well as any vacancy increase, these old buildings are in serious jeopardy of becoming dilapidated. In fact, I've spoken to many owners, some who testified here tonight,
that have said they have canceled all their major capital improvement projects for this year and for next. Some are even saying they may leave apartments vacant permanently until some sensible modification to this legislation is replaced. So more than ever now, fair rent increases are needed to keep up with these costs so our properties can be safe, clean, and appealing to us as owners, and like we said before, our customers, the tenants. You see the relationship between the owner and the tenant, for the most part, is generally amicable. It's a symbiotic working relationship where both are dependent on the other. We try to keep our properties as nice as possible so that the tenants can be proud of their homes as well as their communities. But small owners can't absorb the low rents or the low rent increases that this board has been issuing for the last several years. There have been 2 rent freezes over the last 8 years. We have to constantly repair broken or faulty pipes, restore a boiler, hot water heater, upgrade our electricity, point some brickwork, fix a parapet wall, paint over graffiti, or repair a trip and fall hazard by replacing sidewalk flags. And we like to shine our marble lobbies and stairwells. We like to sweep in front of our courtyards. We plant annuals and perennials. We replace a fence. We upgrade sprinkler systems. We replace garage doors. We take pride. And the list is never completely checked off. So these old buildings, that was said from the young lady that lives in Wisconsin part-time, they have charm and character, and we want to show good character by maintaining them, but now we don't know if we can do that. So with the removal of these programs, what are owners, especially the small owners, supposed to do? Carol Danziger of Mamaroneck testified in White Plains, where all but 2 of her 18 apartments rent for an amount less than what it costs to operate an apartment. According to the tables, which you have and you've reviewed, it costs $1,115 in expenses per month to operate an apartment in Westchester. The vacancy bonus, which was a necessary and integral component of the old law, which allowed an owner to increase the rent to market after an apartment that has been occupied for decades finally vacates. Now that's gone. And so to further make it difficult, an owner is capped at $15,000 per apartment for an individual apartment improvement over 15 years. That means that if an apartment renting for $800 vacates, the owner is allowed to increase the rent $90. It costs $1,100 to run an apartment in the county. Most of the testimony from the tenants has been about poor living conditions and affordability. And while we are empathetic to this issue, the tenants' living expenses cannot be considered an expense to the owner. I can assure you that we want to keep our tenants, we don't want to evict them. But we have a business to operate, and if there's no rent collected or payment plans not honored, or court stipulations fail, we have no viable alternative other than to repossess the property.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Call Genevieve Roche. She also is a former member of this board representing the tenants. Welcome.
Let's keep her to 5 minutes too.
Before I begin, as you know, Dennis,
You have to speak louder because the microphone is not working. No.
Before I begin, as you know, Dennis Hanratty, who usually splits this with me, and I'm here tonight due to an illness. And I slashed my presentation in half, but I probably will need a little more than 5 minutes, maybe 9 minutes. So I would appreciate indulgence if other people.
I don't think that it's fair for the other people. You will get 5 minutes.
People asked for the landlord early on, asked for a little indulgence.
2 speakers.
Yeah, but the other speaker is not here. Just 5 minutes.
No, I don't mean that. Okay. Well, all I'm suggesting is some other people went a little bit over. I'm sort of giving a heads up.
Yes. Yes.
This is going to be part of it. There's no microphone.
No. Just project your voice.
tenant representative. I am here tonight to testify on behalf of tenants. There is no longer any debate that the affordable housing crisis is very, very real. There is plain and simply just not enough affordable housing for those renters who do not come close to making enough to satisfy the fair housing wage needed to rent a two-bedroom family apartment. There is also no debating the fact that for the last 22 years, from 1997 until last Friday, when sweeping rent law reform was finally enacted, rental housing in Westchester became more and more unaffordable, while at the same time the loss of regulated units kept accelerating. And while the hemorrhaging of units has now thankfully come to an end, those lost units, unfortunately, at least for now, aren't coming back. Owners pocketed their outsized profits at a cost to the public of an eviscerated supply of regulated units. But just because the remaining regulated units are no longer at risk of deregulation, emphatically does not mean that they are affordable. The goal now is to keep the remaining units at a level of rent as affordable as possible. The sole job of the board is discrete and well-defined, to determine what, if any, percentage rent increase will, consistent with the facts, be sufficient to keep the rents of the remaining units at the lowest possible affordable rate that also allows owners to cover expenses and make a reasonable profit. For a number of reasons I will explain, that number this year is 0. On the first issue of affordability, I obviously won't have time to address this, but my full written statement and handouts explain why past practices have accelerated more and more units into the upper range of regulated rents, which fall outside the affordability range for the average Westchester renter. However, it is imperative for you to understand the impact that every fraction of every percentage point increase in guideline rates has on the average renter, making only 57% of the necessary hourly wage for affordability. Close to 60% of renters in Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle, where 73% of rent-stabilized tenants live, are rent burdens paying more than 30% of household income on rent. With respect to the second issue of what constitutes a reasonable owner profit in the context of its unaffordability, at this juncture, public members understand all too well that my past analyses invariably show that owner net operating income provides more than sufficient return. This year is no exception, and for a fourth straight year in a row, net operating income remains between 37 and 39%, this year at 38%. Owners predictably argue now that the party's over and that the new rent laws will curtail this two-decade-long free-for-all, that going forward rent increases are the only way they can cover their expenses and provide building maintenance. I have 5 responses. Number 1, rent guideline increases are by and large used to cover routine monthly expenses, not capital expenditures. Past increases that are already embedded in base rents are sufficient to cover these, absent a showing if particular expenses have accelerated beyond historical levels and are sufficiently large to wipe out reasonable profits. Hardly a likelihood nor the past reality, with net profits at a consistent 37 to 39% for the last 4 years. Number 2, don't forget that when customary expenses like heating oil go up, in 2008 to unprecedented levels, rent increases passed at that time to accommodate that increase are not later returned to tenants in the form of rebates or reduced rents. Heating oil is a great example this year. Crude oil prices have plummeted 20% in just the last couple of months, and the latest June 2019 government forecast projects a steady, lower than 2018 rate through 2019 and 2020, based on larger inventories, decreased demand, and a record high level of 2018 U.S. production that is on course to set a second record in 2019. Third, the board should also factor in the fact that last year's guideline rates of 2 and 3% were particularly harsh, the highest in all 4 counties, not supported by the facts, and quite frankly, aberrational is the best word I can use to describe them. I ask that you please keep in mind last year's injudicious increases now embedded in base rents when considering the appropriate amount for this year. 4, the board would also need to factor in the current level of profit that has already been made in 2019 prior to the effective date of the new rent law. Attached is a handout I prepared that shows the revenue affect millions for each 1% increase in rents. Owner's argument that number 5, and my final argument, owner's argument that properties will fall into decline and owners will sell their buildings and run for the hills because they won't be able to afford repairs is a shibboleth. Remember that 1 in 5 units is rent regulated. Owners continue to earn market rate profits on the other 80%. Second, all the millions spent on lobbying and ad campaigns can now, going forward, be funneled into maintenance. Third, owners are mandated by law to maintain their buildings, and anyone selling will be doing so not because they can't afford to maintain the buildings, but because they are not willing to dip into that 38% net operating profit to do so. And that is their choice. I find it more than a little ironic that owners who poo-pooed my past calculations on the vast amount of revenues being made from practices now eliminated are now claiming they can't survive without these additional profits.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes,
I have a couple
Mrs.
of
Stewart.
questions. Would you please explain further about footnote number 10 on the oil handout, since oil was something that the owners spoke about a lot? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yes. So footnote number 10 in the handouts is the attachment that the cover page says Lower Hudson region. So what the handouts show is that crude oil prices are 18.9% lower and mid-Atlantic inventories are 55% higher than a year ago. Lower Hudson heating oil prices are 6.3% lower than last year. If you look at the cover page of the Lower Hudson chart, we produce this chart every year. So if you see highlighted, so in 2007 and 2008, these were the historical increases in oil prices. And if you look at the rate as of May, and now June is another 20%, it's nowhere near that rate, and it's already embedded in the base rents, the increases for that. The other statistics in the handouts show, again, document that U.S. production is high, that inventories are high, and that prices are good.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes. Would you be good enough to...
Excuse me? Please, the public has to be silent when someone is making a presentation. Have some courtesy. Yes.
Would you please be good enough to...
I can't hear you start.
Would you be good enough to explain footnote number 5 in the rate stabilized units acceleration range about above 1,500 that handout gave out?
Yes, so that's the second page in the handouts. So this is similar to something that we've produced every year, and it shows the comparison of the rent ranges by rent under 1,000, 1,000 to 1,500, 1,500 to 2,000, over 2,000. And the chart this year shows that more and more units have accelerated because of high rates, vacancy, etc., into the range above $1,500 a month. At this point, excuse me one second while I just look at this. At this point, there's been a 27% increase in 2 years in the number of apartments that have now flipped into the over $1,500 a month rent. So these apartments are, in essence, based on the affordability housing statistics, which I can't talk about because I didn't have time, but it is in my statement. These apartments are in the range that are just simply not affordable to an average Westchester renter earning the wage that they earn.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I have one last question.
Yes.
On page 4, line 11, handout the handout that's about the additional millions in revenues for every 1% increase. Could you please explain that a little further?
Right. So that handout is, I think, the 4th page of the handouts. The caption is 131,758 rental units in Westchester in 2018. So what this does is capture, based on the DHCR data and the ACS census data, the fact that about 20, almost 22% of Westchester rental units are rent stabilized, so about 1 in 5. And what it also shows is that using the DHCR data, how many units are in each of these ranges. You can see that for the ranges over 1,500, these are the numbers that I've said, there's been a 27% jump in those because more apartments have been pushed into that unaffordable range. And I did a calculation, as I have done in prior years, as to each 1% increase in rent that you would pass, what that would mean for owners in terms of additional revenues on top of what they're already making. So I think if you'll see that I didn't add it all up, but it's $709,000 for every 1% increase in units under $1,000 a month, between $1.25 and $1.87 million per 1% increase for every apartment between 1,000 and 1,500. For apartments between 1,500 and 2,000, that would garner an additional 1.2 to 1.6 million for every 1 percentage point increase. And for the 15% of units that are now over $2,000 a month, that would garner between $1 million and $1.475 million per every percentage point increase. So I think this pretty well shows how much money, what the effect is and how important it is, given the affordability issues, not to pass rents that aren't necessary given the current net level of profit. And secondarily, you've got to also factor in that they are already going to get in 2019 market rents on the 188 units that were deregulated in 2018, plus the additional ones so far in 2019 through last Friday. They also are going to have market rent, additional revenues on the market rents based on vacancy increases in 2018, and the additional ones so far in 2019 through last Friday, as well as the other 80% of units in Westchester that are market rent.
Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you, Ms. Rose.
I would ask you to please read my whole written statement,
Sure.
because it really has a lot of research and information.
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion.
1 minute. I believe that brings us to the end of the list of speakers. I don't think I'm missing anybody. I double checked already. We're going to take a brief recess, and we are going to talk among each other about the presentations for the...
Well, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn to tomorrow. It's 20 after 9. We're all tired. I've worked all day. And we can come back tomorrow, make the presentations by landlords and the tenants with a fresh mind, and a rebuttal, and then we vote. But it's just simply, in my opinion, too late at this point. Mr. Finger has a pretty lengthy presentation. I'm sure Ms. Stewart does as well. And we'll be until after 10 o'clock if we don't adjourn at this point.
I think we have to submit that to vote.
I second that.
We have to submit that to vote.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
So I'm going to go Eddie May. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree.
Evelyn?
Yes.
Tamara?
No.
Lamont?
I mean, I have time, so no.
I also have time, so I said no.
All right. No, I say yes. It says four votes for. That's which majority.
And he says yes.
Both of us, yes.
So the motion passes.
So it's 4-3. It's not a majority, but it's a procedural motion. So motion carries. It wouldn't be enough to carry on a vote for a guideline, where we need 5 votes. But on the vote to adjourn, I think.
Okay.
May I put something on the record, please?
It's adjourned.
Yes, no, wait.
Before we adjourn, I just want to say that Barbara Hanson has been recording this. This will be up by probably noon tomorrow, so that Acquah, who's not here today, will have the ability to watch this tomorrow. So she will before she deliberates and votes. And anybody else can watch it as well. Barbara, you want to say what the website is?
Wait, I haven't adjourned the meeting yet.
It's on YouTube.
We adjourned voted for tomorrow, but we haven't.
The Building and Realty Institute YouTube channel.
Done, we'll do it tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do I have a vote to adjourn?
It's adjourned.
We're adjourned.
Are you going to